Sounds like somebody who... Well, good afternoon or good evening, Murray, because you're obviously somewhere else. The purpose of this talk is to have a look at the tools of the medieval embroiderer. In other words, what tools did they use and how do we know what they used and how can we find things that are suitable for us to use that will give us a medieval embroidery kit. So the way I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to start by going through a lot of images that either are extant objects or are images of them depicted in art from the time. And we're going to have a look at all of the different elements that need to go into your embroidery kit and then talk about what are practical ways of achieving that. So I'm going to share my screen with you and run through a slideshow. Okay, so I'm just checking that everybody can see that. Yep,
yes,
okay.
That's clear, thank you. Yep.
Great. So, as I said, tools of the medieval embroiderer. We're here because we're interested in medieval embroidery, and most of us take a great deal of care to make sure that the designs that we use, the fabrics that we use, the threads that we use, and so on are all appropriate to the time and the style that we're doing. But so many of us are doing this with a modern kit in our bags. So what we're using and what we're producing is medieval, but the way we're doing it, not necessarily so. And at home, that doesn't matter. But if you're sewing at an event, it's nice to make it look right. So let's have a look at all the different elements that go into a kit and what was done and when and how that changed. Needles are the essential tool, and fine needles were essential for fine sewing and for embroidery. So we know that there were needles going back to really ancient times. But there were metal needles from about 100 BC. Bronze needles were used from Rome to the Norman conquest. But iron needles came in much earlier than people realize, about from 3 BC. And they were pretty common from the 12th century. Islamic invasions from the Mediterranean brought steel as opposed to iron. Steel has carbon in it, brought steel needles to Spain. And steel is much stronger, which means that you can make the needles even finer. And steel needles, as we know them, came in about the 12th to 14th century, depending which part of Europe you're in. And by the 16th century, that's what you had. Everybody was using steel needles. This one that I've just put up here is an iron needle, not steel, from the V&A. And the needle itself is 3.5 centimeters long. So if you think about it, that's basically the size of a fine sewing needle that we would use now. And there is a lot of misinformation about needles. I see a lot of people trying to work with needles made of bronze or bone or whatever, trying to be, using period tools. But in fact, if you think about the embroideries that they were producing, like this silk on linen from Egypt in the 6th to 8th centuries, or this 10th century silk and understitched gold, you can only achieve this kind of fine detail if you're using a fine needle. You cannot do it if you're using a coarse needle. You need a really fine detail. So we have some archaeological evidence for fine needles, and we have a lot of evidence in the embroideries themselves. So how are needles stored? Manufacture, that was the next thing I was going to do. So there's some great pictures from the house book, which show various artisans at work, craftsmen at work. So here's a needle maker, and you can see that he's got his tools, he's got files, he's got bundles of needles that are bound up. This is another image of a needle maker where he is working in the background and his wife or daughter or somebody is assembling needles in the front ready to sell. You can see that she's pinning them into sheets of paper, rows and rows of needles. And you used to buy needles like that. Even I can remember my mother having needles like that. And they were then sold, the needles, by traveling peddlers and at fairs. What were they kept in? Well, we have some early needle cases from the Viking era, which were made of bone or often of metal as well, the same sort of horizontally hung style, both the metal and the bone ones.
Rowan, there's a question. Is there, Eva's asked if there is a handout available for this.
There will be. Because I was recording this, I had to go through my 60 images and replace them with Creative Commons images, which has taken me all week to do. So the handout is not yet there, but it will be. Back to needle cases. So the first ones were of bone or wood, and as I said, often held sideways, the Viking ones. Medieval ones, the most common style seems to be leather, but there are also some of bone and wood. And when you get into a bit later, this is the 14th century, you're getting metal needle cases, either in pewter or later on in copper alloys. In the 16th century, the ones on the left are pewter, the one on the right is brass. And I'm wanting to highlight a couple of features here in these. You can see that they have little hollow bits on the side. Those are for running cords through so that you can make sure that you never lose the cap of your needle holder. So the cords run through both sets and then they're tied off underneath the bottom one, and it means you never lose the cap. Some people have thought that they're for hanging, but the length of the threads, the length of the cords on the few that they found are much too small for that. They're just long enough to be able to get the lid off and get the needles out. The leather one in the bottom there from Dordrecht also has slots in the side for the same purpose. You just can't see them on the leather. And here's a very odd shaped one, which from the Netherlands. Same sort of effect though, metal with the bits on the side for stringing them together. Pins. Pins are not as important when you're doing embroidery, but you do sometimes need to use them. And we certainly need to use them for construction sewing, although they did a lot more basting than we did, which meant you didn't need lots and lots of pins. There are a lot of misapprehensions about pins. There are lots of extant pins around, but the pins that are around are mostly dress pins with large heads. There are some extant examples. They don't survive well in the archaeology, nor do needles, they're so fine. But this is a lovely leather pin case from the 14th century. And we know it's a pin case because it had pins in it. So not only were these small cases used for holding needles, they were also used for holding pins, possibly both at the same time. And you can see on this example, the cord that I spoke of, linking the two ends together. There are some lovely images of pins in art. This one from 1490, you can see her hands resting there, and you can see some brass pins there. And you can also see a steel needle. So at that time, she's using brass pins, but a steel needle. And you can also see her thimble, her ring thimble as well. Prehistoric pins were made of thorns and fishbone and so on, but fine bronze pins were used through the Dark Ages. And brass pins then became the most common. Steel pins you started to get in the 16th century, but steel was very much more expensive. So brass pins were still the norm through the 16th century. Here are some brass pins from the Mary Rose, and you can see there are different sizes there. So the one on the right, that wouldn't have been used as a sewing pin, was probably used as a dress pin. And here are some pins from my collection. So these are 16th century brass pins. And you can see I've put the scale at the top, that many of these are exactly the same size as modern pins. And what were they held in? Oh, manufacture. So the way that they were made is the early ones were made by hammering out the wire and therefore they weren't very fine. But as soon as they started using drawn wire, then they could become a lot more fine. The early ones were made by taking a piece of the wire and taking another piece of the wire and wrapping that around the end to make the head, and then hitting it with a hammer so that it would stay shut. And they did that actually for quite a long time, the wrapped wire heads. But there were some disadvantages. They would snag a bit. So you can see here in this example, though, that the wrapped wire was still being used all the way through to the 17th century. In this case, the wire's been wrapped, then it's been put into basically a little cup mold and then hit so that it would form nicely. But the flat end of our modern pins was something that actually started in about the 15th century. This is a pinner's bone. Once the head was made, they would put it in the pinner's bone, and the bit where there's a block on the right-hand side, if you can imagine that's not there. I've had a lot of trouble trying to find a Creative Commons image for this. And you can see there are grooves in the end of the sheep's bone, and they would put the pin in that with the head towards the person who was making the pin, and they would file away from it. And that's how you get your sharp point on the pin. And each pin was handmade. So a person who is making pins could make about 20 pins a day. If you put that into context and you think about how much that means they're going to cost, you can see that pins were actually quite expensive. Right, here is an image of some people making pins, and you can see that the guy in the back is filing the pins, and then they've got groups of pins around, and again they're putting them together in sets to sell. Thimbles. Early thimbles, there are some Roman thimbles, and I was trying to find a picture, but no luck, maybe later. Well, there were pictures, but not ones I was unable to use. So the early Roman thimbles were domed. They were like small round thimbles that were cast, and they had the pits drilled into them. But interestingly enough, there have been no Roman thimbles found in the UK. It's really curious that it was something that you find in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe and near the Middle East, but you don't find in the UK. Anglo-Saxons used leather thimbles. I don't have any examples of those. They don't survive well in the archaeology. So when we're looking at the thimbles, you can see that initially they were cast and the holes were drilled in. These lovely ones at the top with the pointed tops, those you find in Spain and the Moorish countries. It was obviously not only a feature of their architect, they like their thimbles shaped that way too. So the early round ones, then from the 14th century, they were quite pointed. A lot of them have a hole in the top. There's discussion about the fact that maybe that was to help them make the holes in them. Then they became more rounded through to the 15th century. And there were also thimble rings that were used. These ones you can see were made by cutting a strip and then soldering it shut. And later on, they were cast as well. Here's an example of both thimbles and rings from the Mary Rose, and you can see both of them were in use at the same time. In the 16th century, you start to get flat-headed, flat-topped thimbles. So instead of being rounded on top, they've got a much flatter top, and they were much thinner. And a lot of them were then decorated. You start to get mottos and things happening around the base. Initially, here's an image of a man making thimbles. They were cast, and then he's using a drill to drill out the small little holes. So he's got the thimble on basically like a wooden thimble, a wooden finger, and then he's drilling that on a press. Later on, oh, my thing didn't work. I had another picture which showed that later on the indentations were punched rather than drilled. Scissors. Moving on to scissors. The earliest forms of scissors were snips, shears, and there are some lovely ones from really quite early, including this gorgeous set from China. From the Viking Age, this style of the bowed shears, they were already in really quite a refined form. But they had scissors, real genuine scissors, even from the Viking Age. They were rare, but they did exist. And the snips form, the shears form, was used all the way through the Middle Ages, and indeed all the way through the Renaissance, and you can still buy them today as thread snips. Scissors became more common. The most common form of the scissors had quite a small loop at the end. The big pair that I've got in there were probably for cutting cloth. They had bigger loops. There were lots of different terms from them. And they were made by the Cutlers Guild. They were made by the same people who made knives. So I don't have a specific picture of people making scissors. Scissor cases are a really interesting thing. If you're going to have them floating around in your workbox, particularly the shears, those 2 points can be quite dangerous. So there's a really early example from the Bronze Age of a carved wooden case with the shears. And it had a lid also made of wood with a pivot, so it pivoted open. But most of the cases for them in the Middle Ages were made of leather. So they looked a bit like knife cases, and they had hanging loops like knife cases. You can tell that they're made for shears rather than for knives because the seam is running down the center of the back. When you've got knives, then the seam tends to run around the side. There are also some examples of very fancy cases. This is from a painting, and you can see that the same thing with the casework, the leather case made with the loops so that you don't lose the lid. And you can see that this is obviously a very precious and ornate pair of scissors. In fact, famous artists did designs for the leatherwork on scissor cases, and this is a very fancy design for a scissor case. But even right towards the end, we had snips and they had cases as well. So all the way through. Threads. Well, I'm not going to talk about sourcing threads, but just about the kinds of threads that we're using. So we do our embroideries using linen threads, using woolen threads, and using silk and gold. And those were the materials of the medieval and Renaissance embroiderer. They weren't using cotton to embroider. They were using linen, usually for white work or later lace work. Wool and silk was by far and away the most common thread that was being used. Thread holders. I have been looking at and for thread holders for many, many, many years, and it's very interesting to see what you do and don't see. There is a very early Birka find, which shows one made out of antler, which was a thread holder. But this style, which looks pretty familiar to us, is not then something that you see in the medieval and Renaissance context. What you do tend to see are these wooden long spools. And I've got medieval examples, and this is a 16th century example here. You also see them on hollow cores, and not from the paintings, but from other sources, it appears that these were quills. When you're drawing with a quill pen, eventually it gets to the point where you can't use it. So that the hollow quill was being used as a hollow thread spool storer. And you can see that there are wooden storers here holding the spools of coloured thread. Now, both of those examples are Italian, and they're both 14th century. Right at the end of the time period, so right at the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, you're starting to get things that look amazingly like regular thread spools. This one came up in the Batavia wreck off the West Australian coast. There are some other things that are not spools that are other ways of storing threads, and I'm going to show you those later.
Eva has commented that the Mary Rose ones were nice because they had a top that come off and held needles, and also she thought it was a sailor's sewing kit.
Yes, so coming back to this one here, both of those things are true. So the end comes off and the needles are stored inside, but they were for coarse work. So they would have been for working on sails. However, I have some related examples that are clearly for embroidery, which I was very excited to find. Frames. When you're doing work that requires you to keep the ground fabric under tension, so particularly for things like gold work, you need to keep the fabric taut in a frame. The round frames that so many people use, and are certainly very easy and convenient, are an 18th century phenomenon. They came in during tambour work when that became a craze, hence the term, like a tambourine. But up to that point, and certainly all the time during our time period, all of the frames were rectangular frames. They weren't round frames. You can see this lovely example from the 14th century. And you can see examples with somewhat more detail from later. So this 15th century Italian example, you can see that she's got a wooden frame. You can see that the ends go through the stretches and are pegged, and that the fabric itself is whipped through the holes in the frame. And also that the ends of the frame are resting on two trestles, which makes it a really convenient way for her to work. But you can pick the frame up and move it around. And here's an image of the gold embroiderer, the 16th century. And you can see he also has a wooden frame, but his wooden frame is then sitting on two rails, which are attached under his table so that he can just work at it, lift it up and move around. I've actually done this on my sewing room table. I have an arrangement which means I can pull that out to rest my frame on. And it's a really, really convenient way to work. But not all work was done with frames. There's a lot of work that's just worked in the hand. A lot of wool work, a lot of the other work that we do, perhaps most of the work that we do, is just worked in the hand. And you will have noticed when you're working in the hand that it can get really tiring. And the way that they got around that problem was that they used a pillow. So they would rest the work on the pillow, and that just raises it up enough that you have less eye strain. It makes it a comfortable distance, but you're not having to support your arms all the time. And you'll find that there are lots and lots of images of people working on pillows. In fact, it's quite hard to find a picture of somebody embroidering that doesn't have a pillow. Here are a couple of other examples. You can see from the Cluny tapestry, there's a pillow under the work. And from the Truchen book, again, she's working on a pillow. Some of these are plain, sometimes they're ornate, but yeah, it actually turns out to be a really practical tool. The next thing is patterns. How did people know what patterns to do? Well, they would teach each other. And to begin with, the way that patterns were taught and remembered and recorded was that you would work a little piece. And we do that ourselves. I want to show somebody how a stitch is. I'll sew a bit and get them to sew a bit, and then they'll probably take away that scrap of fabric. But a much more convenient way of doing that is to keep it in a sampler. And although we think of samplers now in the 17th century sense, when we've got elaborate framed things, and indeed I have a gorgeous one that sits on my wall that my great aunt made, that wasn't samplers. The samplers were a working piece of equipment. So they were usually bands that were quite narrow, and you could roll them up and put them in your workbook. So you would just work a little bit of each stitch to admire somebody else's work and copy it down while you could, and then you'd have it for your reference. Some of these samplers still exist, although there aren't extant examples before the 16th century, but we know from wills and we know from many other sources that samplers were being made and that they were being left as important parts of people's legacy to their daughter or to their favorite friend. So there are a number of band samplers, which are the ones in the long bands, and also ones where people just did spots. But even there, you can see that they're doing just a small amount, and they keep it as their own personal record. There was a revolution in about 1523 when the first pattern books started coming out. With the invention of the printing press, pattern books were one of the very early mass-produced things for the general public. And there are a lot of them, first in Germany and then copied into Italy and then spread all over the place. So here are some examples drawn in pattern books, and you can see that the bottom one is clearly for counted work. It's placed on a grid, and you can just, it's a chart. You can just work straight off it. The one above it is clearly for a non-counted work. It's a flowing line design. And here you can see an image of somebody working, and they've got their pattern book open on top of their work basket, and they're working the pattern from the pattern book, just as we would do. Finally, the kit. What are you going to put it in? Well, again, we have lots of examples. They're basically two groups of things. The first is wooden boxes. So things like shaker boxes, usually oval, thin, and you can see they're often around with balls of thread or spools of thread. Secondly is the work basket. This is even more common, and baskets of various sort with things in them that clearly indicate that they're embroidery or work baskets are really common. So you can see this example has a pair of scissors very clearly, and also another form of thread holder, which looks like quite a fat spool with some thread wrapped around it. Here's a slightly blurry picture that I took, and you can see that it looks exactly like every fruit basket that you've ever seen. And inside is the embroidery and a beautiful little pair of gold scissors, possibly brass. And here's from a 16th century woodcut. Actually, it's from the introductory page to one of the pattern books, where you can see her sitting there with her work basket by her side. And now I'm going to have a look at some photos in detail where we look at the different elements. So these pictures are ones that I have, mostly ones that I have taken in museums. And so I've been able to get a pretty good zoom in on them. So here's one which I took in the Louvre. And the thing that astonishes me is incredibly detailed. You can see every part of the weave of this basket. So you can see that if you were into making baskets, I think that you could make this based on what we can see here. We can even see how it's closed. It's got a little loop, and we can see how the lid is, and that it's got decorative colored bits. And inside, we can see a pair of shears, a pair of snips, and we can also see a band. Now, you do see a lot of these rolled up things sitting around in sewing baskets. When those baskets don't have any scissors in them and are at the foot of somebody and they're in a birthing scene, like, you know, birth of Jesus, birth of Mary, then I think they're probably swaddling bands because that's what they were using. But when they're in a sewing context, there's no reason to have a swaddling band there. So I think that these are probably rolled up samplers. Here's another example. This is a lush picture, and it has lots of fabulous things. Firstly, you can see the basket that everything is sitting in. And over on the right-hand side, my right-hand side, you can see a pillow, which is clearly made out of shot silk with blues and oranges coming through. That's a working pillow. Here you can see the scissors, and again, they're in the form of shears. Here you can see some fabulous thread holders. The one which is made, which has been turned on a lathe with lots and lots and lots of different sections for different threads, all in the one thing. So you've always got the right color. You can also see balls of thread with needles stuck into them, like we all do. Here you can see two pins, or two needles rather, that have been just stuck into the end of the working cushion. Again, you know, we all do that. You just stick it into where it's convenient. But I was really amused to see them sticking in here. So somebody's been working with the red thread and they've just stuck the end in. And this perhaps is a sampler book, because why else would you have a book sitting in your working basket? Here's another example. Here are the scissors, this time in snips form and with a cord attached to the base. Here are some thread holders, and you can see them in two forms. One is the quill form with the thread wrapped around and round, clearly silk, you can see the shine. And the other is in a flat form where a piece of paper, probably given the date, or vellum is in a square, and the thread has been wound around it in two opposing directions. You can also see a large ball of thread. Up here, you can see two pins stuck into this really interesting kind of pear-shaped cushion, which could be a working cushion, or it could be perhaps heavy and is being used as an anchoring working point.
There was a question about lids for the baskets.
Yep.
Were there basket lids, or it's surprising to see so many baskets without lids?
Almost all of the ones that you see have no lid. But if you think about it, these were baskets that were just sitting around. They weren't being carried to places. They were just sitting around. They were the basket that you were working in. They lived in your house by your chair, and you just picked things up and worked out of them all the time. So when I started looking, yes, I was surprised too. But mostly they don't have lids. Mostly they're this open, slightly flared shape. And that's what we see all the time.
You also have another question about, could it be a lace making cushion, which is used for anchoring the pins?
It could possibly be, but if you look at the associated tools, they're not lace tools. These are embroidery tools. You can even see the fact that the thread on the spool and the flat section matches the colors of the thread in the embroidery. This is an embroidery kit here we're talking about. So I think it's a working cushion. Here's another much simpler one, but again, we can see that thread wrapped two ways on the piece of what looks like cardboard here. I have no idea what that white round thing is, because it doesn't have any indications of looking like thread, and given the level of detail in the basket, you'd expect it to. So I think it's something else. But again, we have this book. And again, I think, perhaps it's a pattern book. And back to the picture of the gold worker. And now, not only if you look at the frame, but all of the other things, you can see that he has a pair of scissors sitting on where he's working and another pair on the table. You can see he's got thread in an oval wooden box and in skeins and in balls. And you can also see that he has this really nifty container with multiple sections in it for holding the pearls and the beads and the spangles and all the things that he's going to be working into his gold work, which is a really practical idea. So now coming back to kit, here are the kinds of things that we would typically be using. And we can replace those with medieval versions of the same thing. So instead of needles and pins and sticking them into a pin cushion, and one of the things I forgot to say explicitly is that pin cushions turn out not to be a medieval thing or a Renaissance thing for sewing pins. They absolutely existed, but they were for dress pins, and all of the examples that you see of them have large pins with large decorative heads on them. So they were for holding the dress pins that you needed to get it dressed, because certainly in the 16th century, a lot of your clothing was put together with pins, and a lot of the headwear in earlier times was also put together with pins. So pin cushions, the few that exist, they're highly decorated, beautifully embroidery ones, not for sewing pins, they're for dress pins. Okay, so what we should be using instead of those things is needle cases. And you can get simple wooden ones really cheaply. They're a great step up. You can make them out of leather or pewter. You can buy reproductions out of pewter from several sources. If you're doing early stuff, if you're doing Norse stuff, you can probably make one out of bone. That wouldn't be too difficult. In terms of thimbles, try and avoid the plastic ones or the bright shiny ones with the lines on them, and look for brass ones. They are quite hard to get new, but they're really quite easy to buy secondhand, and that's how I've bought all of mine. In terms of scissors, again, avoid the plastic ones, and also, and this does surprise some people, not the stalk ones. The stalk ones are another 18th century thing. So while they're old, they're not medieval. Instead, look for snips or for simple scissors with simple ends. Instead of keeping your threads on their plastic packets and cones and cores, move them to medieval versions of these. And some of them you can buy on cores already, and they look quite good. Bodkins, something I didn't have time to put the pictures up for in the main area. Try and avoid ones that are plastic or brightly painted, and go for ones that are wooden or made out of bone or made out of metal. And wax. There is a modern thread, call it thread magic, and there are some other sorts, which is for slicking the threads and making it go more evenly. Beeswax is what we use. All those small, beautiful things like these lovely little sequins, put them into little containers. And instead of using a plastic hoop or even a wooden version of the round hoop, a wooden version of a square, of a rectangular frame is really the kind of go. And finally, putting it all together into round boxes or baskets. Now I've got a summary here, and this will definitely be in the notes. What I've done is to basically have a look at all of those different elements and by rough time groupings, so that you can get an idea of the sort of things that you need to be looking at. And all of the images came from places where they support Creative Commons, hurrah, or there were photos that I took. So I'm going to end my share and bring this back. One of the things that, so if we're looking to do our kit, needles, I think that there is good evidence to support the fact that there were iron needles and even steel needles from the 12th century. So modern needles, I would be using good quality modern needles. In terms of pins, the easiest ones to get that are similar to the ones that you can buy are brass lace pins. Brass lace pins are nice and fine. They're made of brass. They don't look like a modern pin. They don't have a wire-wrapped head. They have a flat head, but that was certainly done in the 15th and 16th century, and they are much better than ordinary pins or glass-headed pins, which would have been used as dress pins, but not as sewing pins. For holders, I made this little one out of leather, which is based on a find in the Museum of London. It was actually pretty easy to make. The wooden ones, as we've talked about, some of these also double as thread holders. These simple ones, which you can buy from most haberdashery suppliers, these are pretty good. If you can't get anything else, these will work just fine. So I would encourage you to have a look and think about the elements in your kit and what can you replace and do it over time. And there's kind of two stages of this. One is just removing all of the obviously modern things out of the kit and having generically medieval ones in there. And then the second stage is you might want to have a look at what would have been appropriate to the time period that your particular interest is in, the time that you dress, your persona time, and try and focus in on an embroidery kit for that. That's kind of like a second stage. A few things to avoid. I already talked about the stalk scissors. Thimbles. There are reproduction thimbles that you can get. A lot of them are just not practical. They look great sitting on the desk, but they're too thick, they're too heavy, the pits aren't deep enough, you can't actually wear them. But you can get pretty good reproduction sewing rings and brass thimbles secondhand.
There was another question.
Yes.
Have you seen any kind of laying tools in your research?
By laying tool, expound on laying tool, please.
Laying tool would be a length of highly polished wood or metal that would be used to lay silk thread down so that the threads shined really, really well. I've seen some people say, oh, they would have used an awl, which to me sounds terrifying because I'm going to be the one to stab it through my embroidery. I've also seen the hand-shaped ones that are made out of either modernly made out of plastic or wood. They look very odd and I can't at the moment remember the name for them. I apologize.
I know the things you're talking about. Yes, I haven't seen anything that looks like it was specifically made for that purpose, although there are some bodkin things that could be used for making holes, particularly if you're making holes for laces and so on. But there are some bone tools that are smooth that perhaps were used for that. I haven't seen anything that's specifically identified for that, and I haven't seen anything referenced in the literature that where it's talking about going through a list of tools. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. It's not something that I've yet seen. One other tool that I didn't show you. Do I have it? Because I haven't finished making it. This is my, or will be my brooch for laying gold thread. There are lots of examples in depictions. You can see them in tapestries and a couple of other places where they're showing gold workers working. Basically, you bind fabric over it and then you wrap your gold thread over it. This end, which I haven't finished, has a 3-cornered end on it to stop it rolling around. And then this end has a slit in it to hold your doubled gold threads in. And I think that's going to be a really useful tool when I finish making it. Okay. These sorts of wooden boxes are the sorts of things that I'm thinking of. They are fairly readily available. Little baskets, possibly easier to come by, to hold the tools. In the 16th century, I've also seen square wooden boxes. I haven't seen those in earlier depictions, but I have seen them in 16th century ones.
There's a question as well now about the Viking pipe ones and stoppers. Stoppers. No stoppers are found, so as far as a person is aware, but experimentally putting the needles into a small scrap of fabric, or which stays snug in the needle case. So
absolutely. And indeed, even in some of the later cases, so putting them in the thread, threading the needles onto a scrap of fabric and then putting them in. And indeed, that's a much more practical idea anyway, because you're much less likely to lose them. Working at events, I have had loose needles in my needle case, tipped them into my hand, missed, they've gone into the grass, that's it. And if you think about how precious a needle was, you don't want that to happen. So even on these needle cases, I have a little piece of fabric with the needle stuck through so that I can't lose them. And certainly in the horizontal thing, the friction just holds it in. Good point. Right. Are there any other questions or comments or thoughts?
Leopa's put into the chat, For Anglo-Saxon and Viking, one of the small fine books available from New York Archaeological Trust has a large section of sewing tools. Are they available for download?
Thanks, Leoba. If you could put a link in, that would be brilliant. I thought I'd show you my frame. This is not my final frame. This is my mock-up frame. Naturally, because it's a temporary solution that works. I've now been using it for at least 20 years. So this, probably an exaggeration, probably only 15. This is basically made of laths of wood, which have got holes drilled in it, and I'm using wing nuts at the four corners to hold it together. And I have lots of pieces of frame in lots and lots of different sizes, so I can make up frames of everything from quite a small frame up to really large. And when I'm working on gold work or purling or anything like that, this is the kind of frame that I'm using. And it turns out that having the overlap ends is really useful because you can put them on the table and put a weight on it, and then you've got a hands-free frame, or you can sit it on top of trestles or frames to work on it. The disadvantage with this is because of these being overlapped rather than through each other, that you can get distortion. So you have to watch that and keep it straight. So I have plans for a much more authentic version of the frame, but I haven't yet made them.
Tina has added into the chat a source for the bent wood boxes in the US. There's a link being put into the chat as well. And Eleonora has said that she has seen people put leather stoppers on bone cases, but doesn't know if there's any evidence for that in period.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. But because so much of this is based on the finds and what survives in the ground, some of this is just assumption and extrapolation.
Also, Helga has asked what the source for the painting with the mysterious white ball was, please. She'd like to look it up.
Let's see, I'll have to go and have a look. That's one of the ones that I took. I have been wondering if it might be a glass smoothing ball, but they're normally made of glass. They're not normally opaque. They're normally green and really very obviously a smoothing ball. That painting was Gregorio Martinez, The Annunciation, and I took the picture in Burgos Cathedral. So these aren't available online. I haven't seen these images on Pinterest or on other sources. I don't think Burgos Cathedral has their collection digitized. So these are photos that I've taken.
And Leob has put the download, the archaeological stuff on there to be downloaded on the chat as well, if anybody needs a link. And we also have about 8 minutes left in this class, if you'd like to stop recording or if there's still more questions. All right, I'll stop the recording now.
Okay.
Please feel free to